Morning, Vaughn. So this week ends it seems like every week for the last little while we've been talking about Bill 15,
Yeah.
and that's still before the House. I guess they took a break this week, but they're back next.
Yes, we're down to the wire on Bill 15. The Indigenous leaders and municipal leaders together yesterday had a news conference calling on the government to pause this thing, to do more consultation, which they haven't done, and said you could put it off to the fall. The House sits right after Thanksgiving. You don't have to ram it through this coming week. However, the Premier was asked yesterday at a news conference, what does he think of that? And he said, no, we're pushing it through next week. The government's already set the time. They're cutting off debate and passing the bill 9 o'clock Wednesday night. House adjourns on Thursday. Premier says he's going to prove to Indigenous leaders that he means to include them in consultations, though he hasn't done it yet, on projects, and he'll prove to them that he means what he says. So unless he changes his mind over the weekend, it looks like we're headed for this bill. Bill 15 gives the cabinet sweeping powers to expedite, fast track approvals of public and private infrastructure projects in BC. So hospitals and schools, but also mines and things like that.
And the province does have the authority to do that, at least to pass the bill.
Oh, yeah, they've got the votes.
Okay.
Premier kept his legislative majority by one seat that he won with 22 votes, but that's enough to carry the day. The vote, as I said, the vote they've set up is they pass what's called a closure motion. It's basically they use their majority to pass a motion that says debate ends next Wednesday night at 9 o'clock, and the vote will be called, and the government has the votes to get it through. So that will be passage of Bill 15. The Premier says he's surprised that local government people are upset about the lack of consultation because he says they want all these projects. So why would they be unhappy with us taking steps to make them happen? With Indigenous leaders, it's a bit of a different story. You know, the government admitted in the legislature last week that it was a mistake to draft and complete Bill 15 without consulting Indigenous leaders. They'd promised to consult them, and they didn't. So, but still, in spite of that admission of error, which you think by itself would be reason enough to say, okay, we're not going to pass it this coming week. We're going to consult with you all summer, do the consultations we should have done in the first place, and maybe we'll amend it in the fall. Maybe we'll bring back some more protections. But that's, unless, as I said, unless the Premier changes his mind over the weekend, and he has been known to change his mind, I think that's what we're headed for. Certainly, that's what he said yesterday anyway.
And if it does pass, I mean, the First Nations have threatened potential litigation that would presumably wait for some sort of a project that they would deem did not follow the proper course of action in terms of consultation.
Yeah, and you know, that comment, some sort of project, is interesting, Harold, because one of the things we've asked is, okay, is there some project that's being held up right now that you need this legislation in order to push it through? They've not given us any list of projects, mines or schools or hospitals that are being held up. They've given us examples from the past, but nothing. So again, you sort of go, where's the urgency? I think the other comment that Indigenous leaders have made, which I think is something worth considering, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, he said, you know, Indigenous leaders, we have to think about what would the other party in the legislature do with this kind of a bill. You know, the NDP say, trust us, and we have good intentions. Well, what if the Conservatives were the government? What would they do with this kind of a blank check bill? How would they proceed with projects and use these powers? And I think political parties get into government and they stay there for a while, and then they start to think they'll never be in opposition again. But as we know, hey, when you have an election as close as the one last fall, it was that close to having Premier Rustad last fall. So I don't know why the New Democrats would assume that they're always going to be in government, but they're acting like it. But I think that's a good point. That's a good point for all governments. You're bringing in a piece of legislation. Imagine what the opposition would do with this if you're creating override powers and giving cabinet a lot more power than they already have. And that's what Bill 15 does.
And we've certainly seen examples of that in the past. I'm sure you could cite them chapter and verse where a government in opposition didn't like something, but as soon as they became government, they were all for it.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That sort of happens. It's one of the things that happens with whistleblowers, right? I mean, in opposition parties think whistleblower legislation is terrific. They like access to information laws, too. They're not as enthusiastic about it when they get into government. That's true. They stop writing things down. They use Post-it notes to keep their notes so that the access to information people can't get their hands on it. And they do more business by phone call.
Right. Well, one area where the premier did reverse course was on his special advisor on the downtown east side.
Yeah, I think a point to that is a good example of EB facing up, that he had to cut his losses. He didn't want to do this. He'd recruited the premier, Michael Bryant, former Attorney General of Ontario and the former head of legal aid here in BC, to his special advisor on the downtown east side. The premier said he wanted a fresh pair of eyes to go down there and provide the government with some advice on sorting out a problem that has been there for generations. So the contract with Bryant was 6 months' work, $150,000, and he started work on February the 10th. Government didn't tell anybody, the public anyway, that they'd hired him. And then one of our colleagues over at Global TV, got a hold of it, reported it last week, and there's a huge controversy. Why would you have a special advisor paid that much on the downtown east side and not tell anybody? And the premier's comment on that, his explanation is, well, we meant to, and there was a screw up of some sort in the premier's office, and the announcement never went out. But because of the controversy and the secrecy and the hiding of this appointment 3 months in, and then there was a second controversy, which the premier said he was impressed with Bryant's work at legal aid. Well, the opposition pointed out that Bryant left legal aid last year suddenly for unexplained reasons, and they wanted to know why. And what the premier said this week in announcing that the Bryant appointment had been terminated, and the actual termination was last weekend. The premier announced it Tuesday. He said Michael Bryant and legal aid had become the story. The story was no longer about what we could do for the downtown east side, and that's why EB said he thanked Bryant, said that Bryant had given the government some good ideas, but the contract is terminated. The payout, premier said, was about $75,000. So, EB sounded pretty disappointed. I think he really thought this was going to pay off in some good advice for the government, but he's also a realist. I think he's right that the story wasn't about what we might learn about the downtown east side anymore. It was about the fact that this appointment wasn't announced in the first place, and then nobody had explained why, if the premier thought what he did at legal aid was the reason he deserved the job or was a good choice. Well, what happened that he left legal aid?
Right. Metro Vancouver, back in the news. Whether there needs to be a makeover there. We have the Deloitte report that they're actually this morning, the board is discussing. But there's also the question of whether there needs to be an auditor general for local government, which I understand we used to have one, but we don't now.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so the Deloitte report is a pretty good report. It runs about 50 pages. It's a portrait of an organization that is to some degree internally dysfunctional. Metro Vancouver, it was, started way back. W.A.C. Bennett was premier. It was called the GVRD. And the report really details how the internal dynamic at Metro Vancouver got disrupted by the festering controversy over this North Shore waste treatment plant went from, well, it's $3 billion over budget. A lot of finger pointing, recriminations, mayors who don't want their municipality stuck with the tax bill for paying for it, blame placing on who screwed up. And, it says the report is very good. And it really says that Metro Vancouver is an organization now whose responsibilities have outgrown its structure. This is a giant entity that's managing the Reason, also a sewage district, also a housing program, also water. And this report says you're going to have to look at seriously restructuring this. I think some of the solutions would be controversial, but I think the report makes the case that it needs a makeover, that this original idea of a regional district where the board is made up of mayors and councillors from all 23 municipalities, and that it just isn't working very well. And the related issue that you've referred to is that we've had trouble getting answers of how that sewage treatment plant went $3 billion over budget. The RCMP are investigating how in Richmond, $300,000 worth of gift cards have gone missing and nobody knows where they are. Surrey Council is trying to recover $2.5 million that was fraudulently, they say, dispensed by a former employee. And it all headlines, I think, why there's been calls for us to have an Auditor General for local government, just as we have one for the provincial government. We had one of Christy Clark's better ideas, I would say, when she was premier, but the NDP came in and got rid of it, I guess because it was a Christy Clark idea that couldn't have been a very good idea to them. Local government, I think, was happy because they felt that the provincial government was intruding into their sphere by appointing an Auditor General to oversee their governing and finances. But I think we now see that might have been a kind of a useful operation office to have, and there are calls for the government to, why don't you admit it was not such a bad idea and bring it back, or broaden the powers of the provincial Auditor General so he or she could look into this sort of thing. Independent scrutiny is the idea. I actually think that some local governments could use the office to conduct forensic investigations and trace the money, because not every local government, especially some of the smaller ones, have those kind of resources. I mean, Surrey is saying, well, in Surrey, Linda Annis, councillor, says we should have our own auditor here in Surrey. And she's probably right. Surrey's a big enough city that it could probably have its own. But there's lots of smaller places that may not need that office full time, but might be able to draw on the resources from time to time when $300,000 worth of gift cards go missing.
And so what does the Municipal Affairs Minister, Ravi Kahlon, say about that idea?
Oh, he's not persuaded that this is needed. I mean, it would basically mean admitting they got it wrong. The NDP did when they got rid of the office. So I guess even though it was the previous NDP Premier, John Horgan, that got rid of it, I mean, David Eby doesn't hesitate to interfere in municipal government. His housing bills go much farther than anything Christy Clark did. And Bill 15, of course, walks roughshod over them on any kind of project. So I don't know why David Eby would be reluctant to have an auditor looking over their shoulder. He's looking over their shoulder in every other way. So maybe he'll bring it back.
Well, we did see that this week with the special advisors appointed by Ravi Kahlon in Oak Bay and West Vancouver. Yeah. They came back with their reports as well. Yeah.
I mean, the municipalities don't like this, but I would say that municipal governments have been sufficiently dominated by not in my backyard sentiments that probably there's a case to be made for the provincial government to step in and say, you're going to have to deliver your share of housing and the right mix of housing. So the municipalities rightly say, well, you're going to have to help us with the cost of infrastructure if you're going to do that, because if we put the entire cost of the infrastructure on the housing, it won't be affordable. So I think it's a case for partnership, but I do think there's some merit in the provincial government's idea to step in with some of the less cooperative municipalities and say, you're going to have to build some housing that's affordable for people, just like everybody else in the province.
Well, that is where the rubber hits the road. I mean, I know it happens all over the region, whether it's schools in Surrey or hospitals in other parts of or Surrey again, or other parts of the region or the province. But, I was struck by something in the advisor's report in West Vancouver where he said Park Royal should become a transit hub and allow for higher density. But admitting there's all kinds of transportation issues there already. So in doing this, TransLink should also spend a bunch of money on new transit. But we know TransLink doesn't have any money.
Well, yes, we've had a running issue in the legislature for the past couple of weeks. The provincial government signed a bailout for TransLink, $300 million to get them through the next 2 or 3 years. They also agreed, the province did, to work with TransLink on a new source of revenue. And that's, everyone reaches for their wallet when they hear new source of revenue. So at the moment, I would say the consensus is that TransLink is probably going to ask for a vehicle levy as a new source of revenue. That levy would be presumably collected by ICBC along with your insurance, and it would be passed on to TransLink for this funding bailout. I've heard figures of $100 to $200 a year for the vehicle levy. It's thought that that will be politically more palatable than, say, road pricing or putting it on the gas tax or sales tax, which was voted down a few years ago, or more on the fare box, which they're already raising, or property taxes. We'll see how palatable that idea is. They're not going to get to doing it for a couple more years. And of course, we got to go through a provincial election before too long. So I don't know how popular that idea will be when the election rolls around.
All right. Well, it's been, as you know, it's been floated many times, going back to George Kuehl and others back with the creation of TransLink. And it always seems to die on the political altar at some point, because no one wants to approve that.
No, and a government that makes a big deal, Harold, over having gotten rid of bridge tolls is not going to be really all that interested in. And they hand out, what is it, $110 a year you get as a rebate on ICBC. So they're going to give you an ICBC rebate of $110 and then come back and charge you another $100 for TransLink. Like, I don't know how they're going to actually get this through, but that's what they're talking about at the moment, which is a vehicle levy.
Interesting. All right. Well, thanks, Vaughn. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll talk again next week.
Yep. And we'll be finished next week. The suspense is killing me. Will it be Bill 15 or me telling you, hey, at the last minute, they decided, we don't need this thing right away?
What's your bet?
They sound awful stubborn. They've had plenty of chance to back off. It doesn't sound to me like the Premier's going to be backing off on this one. I think he's determined not to back off again. He's already backed off on 2 or 3 things, and he thinks that's enough backing off for this year.
All right. Thanks again.
Bye-bye, Harold.